A dog is man's best friend. The main character knows this better than anyone else because he was a child with a difficult fate who saw in four-legged animals not only friends, but also a family who would do anything for him. At night, the police stop the van and arrest its driver, who turns out to be a bloodied man dressed as a woman. No one can conduct an interrogation, so psychologist Evelyn, who is able to find an approach to any person, is involved in the case. The woman arrives at the police station and meets Douglas. After answering a few questions and telling about herself, she asks the man to be just as sincere and tell how and why he ended up here. Douglas adored dogs since childhood. He is convinced that four-legged friends have all the virtues that humans have, but at the same time do not have any vices. Douglas was the youngest son in a terrible family. His father used to breed fighting dogs and starve them for weeks to make them more aggressive. Mike was a truly creepy man, beating his wife and youngest son for any disobedience or attempt at kindness. At the same time, he and Richie were obsessed with religion, justifying their evil deeds as God's will. Despite the difficulties, there were also joyful moments in Douglas's life. His mother loved to cook and did it while listening to classical French music. The boy loved to listen to old records, and at that moment the world seemed ideal. But soon the father returned home and again beat his wife and son, making their life unbearable. Not finding attention and love in the house, Douglas began to get closer to the dogs because they were sincere and always licked him, trying to become friends. One day, the older brother told his father that Douglas was stealing food from the table to feed the dogs. Having learned about this, Mike not only beat his son, but also threw him to the dogs, saying that the cage is now his new home. A few weeks later, the mother, unable to stand the humiliation and bullying, decided to leave the house. Douglas did not blame her because she was pregnant and wanted to protect her third child from the same fate. Having collected her things, the woman handed her son several cans of food, after which she said goodbye and left once and for all. As a 10-year-old child living in a cage with dogs, he cut a hole in the wall of the barn, where he found several glossy magazines. They helped him learn and develop, and the dogs helped him survive. Some time later, Richie hung up a sign with the inscription, "In the name of God," but from the cage, the younger brother saw only a few letters that formed his nickname for the rest of his life, DogeMan. A few days before the arrest, Dwan came to the abandoned house where DogeMan lived. He met a guard dog on the way, guarding the door like a bodyguard. DogeMan met the guy and accepted a gift in the form of an abandoned dog, promising in return to fulfill any request. Dwan admitted that a new mafioso had appeared in the area, extorting money from local residents, including the old woman Martha, who washed DogeMan's clothes. Having learned about what had happened, he promised to make every effort to ensure that the mafia took the path of correction and no longer posed a threat to them. During the day, DogeMan, hiding in a wheelchair in the guise of a woman, tracked down Diego Morales. The man sent a dog with a phone in his mouth to the criminal to make a phone call. As soon as Diego answered, another dog ran into the bar, grabbing him tightly between his legs. DogeMan warned the mafia about the possible consequences and the chance of losing his manhood. Fearing this, Diego agreed to leave the old woman behind and be more respectable, but as soon as the dogs escaped, he sent several armed mercenaries to catch him. In the morning, Evelyn goes to the house where DogeMan lived until recently and finds several mutilated bodies. There was a shootout as a result of which the police found 10 dead. Returning to the police station, Evelyn decides to continue the conversation with the disabled man to find out how he ended up here. Continuing the story of his childhood, Douglas recalls how one day his brother noticed that one of the dogs had brought puppies. Deciding to mock his brother, Richie informed his father about this, knowing that he would take the lives of innocent puppies. Realizing the inevitability of this, Douglas did not let his father into the cage, starting to scream and bark at him like a wild dog. Mike could not stand it and shot his son, as a result of which the boy lost a finger. Moreover, a bullet fragment got stuck in his spine, turning Douglas into an invalid. He can stand, but only for a few minutes, and if he decides to walk, it will be the last thing he does in his life. The brother, seeing what had happened, forced his father to leave Douglas alone and, after praying, threw him a handkerchief to stop the bleeding. As soon as the family went into the house, the boy hid a piece of his finger in a bag and gave it to the dog so that he could take it to the police. The obedient four-legged friend complied with Douglas' request and brought the police with him, as a result of which Mike went to jail and Richie went to prison, but only for 8 years. When he was freed, the dogs met his older brother Douglas and bit him, avenging his youthful mistakes. Having lost his family, Douglas went to an orphanage, but even there he became an outcast. Finding himself in a cage, but a little larger, he was even more lonely because his beloved dogs were not nearby. It seemed that the world had lost its colors, but the boy met Salma, an aspiring teacher working in the theater. Having fallen in love with a girl, Douglas believed her and became a theater actor. Together, the couple performed dozens of performances, thanks to which the guy was able to hide from reality by transforming into other roles. It seemed that life was getting better, but at one point Salma left forever, having received a more tempting job offer. Soon she became an actress and reached a high level. Douglas watched her all his life, making newspaper clippings and pasting them into his album. Having become an adult guy, Douglas went to the theater to see a girl's performance, and even ended up in her dressing room to confess his feelings. The couple could have been happy, but unfortunately, Salma turned out to be a married woman expecting a child. Disappointed, Douglas returned to the dog shelter, where he worked for several years. He was hysterical and going crazy. The dogs, seeing how bad he was, opened the cage and lay down next to him to calm and support their friend in difficult times. A few days later, people from social services announced that they would close the shelter because it was too expensive for local authorities. The next morning they arrived here with the police, but Douglas and the dogs were no longer there. They found a new home for themselves, creating it in an abandoned building. Evelyn understands that a lot of money was needed to arrange such housing and care for the animals, and is interested in DogeMan's sources of income. He admits that he was looking for a job for a long time, but was rejected until he ended up in a bar. Having demonstrated the ability to stand, he earned 5 minutes on stage to sing a song to the audience. Other singers not only supported the disabled person, but also helped him stand in front of the microphone. It seemed that they would fail, but when Douglas began to sing, the audience was shocked. He sang no worse, and maybe better, than Edith Piaf, making people applaud. The bar owner not only paid generously for the performance, but also allowed him to sing from his stage every week. Without hiding anything from Evelyn, Douglas admitted that this is not the only source of income. Having a great understanding of dogs, he helped people take a pet into their home, selecting the most suitable candidate based on character and upbringing. One day, DogeMan realized that his four-legged friends were listening to him and were ready to carry out any order. Deciding to use this, Douglas organized a dog gang that robbed the houses of the rich. Penetrating into the house, the dogs carried out everything from food to expensive jewelry without much difficulty. This could go on forever, because he has no sense of conscience towards the arrogant rich. But one day an insurer appeared on his way. Ackerman found out about what happened and took CCTV footage. After carefully reviewing all the crimes, he not only realized that the dogs were behind it, but also determined the location of their leader. To begin with, Ackerman visited the bar to listen to Douglas speak and give him flowers. A little later he followed him, discovering an abandoned house. At night, Ackerman snuck inside and began threatening the dogs. Protecting his friends, Douglas allowed him not only to enter, but also to take the jewelry. The insurer could have left, but he decided to stay for dinner and did it in vain, because the only food that evening was himself. Douglas waited for the right moment and ordered the dogs to attack him, as a result of which the jewelry, like the insurer himself, remained in his house forever. Evelyn is shocked by the story and reminds that their conversation is being recorded on a video camera, but Douglas is not at all embarrassed. He continues the interesting story and finally lets the psychologist in on the story that happened last night. On the eve of his arrest, mafiosi and a dozen armed mercenaries broke into an abandoned house. Having obtained useful information from Juan, Diego took the life of an innocent guy. Hearing the shot, Douglas, dressed as Marilyn Monroe, told the dogs that the war had begun. The four-legged animals turned out to be not only obedient companions, but also clever tacticians capable of luring armed people into life-threatening traps. One of the daredevils looked into the wrong hole, as a result of which he lost his face. Another mercenary found himself in a room with exposed wires and lost his life due to a strong electrical discharge. One of them fell victim to a shotgun, and two fell into a trap and ended up in a hole, after which Douglas put them out of their misery. Another mercenary was less fortunate than the others, and he locked himself in a room with a dozen huge hungry dogs who turned him into their food. Douglas also could not avoid being wounded and returned to his quarters. Soon he met with Diego one-on-one, but fortunately the mafia ran out of bullets. Realizing that God was on his side, DogeMan made another order. When he was arrested, the dogs ran away and found freedom, but did not forget about their best friend. At dawn, hundreds of four-legged animals arrived at the police station and entered the building. Having neutralized the guard, the dogs gave DogeMan the keys to the door so that he could get out to freedom. Realizing that his conscience was clear and there was nothing keeping him here anymore, DogeMan stood up and walked towards the church. Each step could be the last in his life, but this does not frighten the man. Finding himself in front of the cross, he fell into eternal sleep, surrounded by hundreds of his best friends. Meanwhile, Evelyn looks out the window and sees a guard dog on the threshold of the house, guarding her and her little son. Realizing that this is DogeMan's last gift,